Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're jumping into something fascinating, definitely messy, and always evolving. We're talking about creativity, the law, copyright, and, well, the very ownership of ideas. We've gathered a whole stack of sources here, looking at everything from the historical roots of it all
Right.
to the really hot modern debates like AI-generated stuff, and even the deeper philosophical questions about who actually gets to control creative expression.
It's a huge topic.
It really is. So our mission today is pretty straightforward. We want to unpack why copyright exists in the first place, what happens when it gets challenged, and what does it all mean for creativity now in an age where, anything can be copied instantly, often by AI.
Yeah.
We're aiming to leave you well-informed, hopefully with a much clearer handle on this really complex legal and, frankly, ethical landscape. Okay, so let's unpack this. We kind of take copyright for granted, right? Like it's always been this way. But it's actually a pretty recent invention in the grand scheme of things. What kicked off this huge shift in thinking about owning ideas? What was it like before?
That's the foundational question. And the answer really takes us back to a genuine revolution. Before the 15th century, copying anything like a book was incredibly slow, all done by hand.
Right, monks in monasteries, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Then around 1440, Gutenberg's printing press just changes everything. Suddenly you can reproduce knowledge cheaply, quickly. By the 1600s, printed stuff is spreading like wildfire,
Yeah.
which means ideas scale up massively.
And so to stealing them, I guess.
Precisely. And what's really interesting is at this point, it was the printers, not the authors, who held all the power. So initially, England's approach wasn't what we'd call copyright today. It was more like licensing and censorship. There was this group, the Stationers' Company, set up in 1557. They had a royal charter. Their job wasn't about protecting authors. It was about controlling who can print what.
Ah, so state control.
Totally. It was the crown wanting to control information, especially anything potentially subversive or anti-government. Power over printing really was power over truth back then.
That sounds much less about creator rights and more like a tool for the state.
Yeah.
So how did we get from that system to something as, well, radical as the Statute of Anne in 1710? What made that law such a game changer?
It really was a monumental shift, philosophically speaking. The Statute of Anne, that's the first true copyright law. And what made it so radical was it explicitly gave authors, not just the printers, the right to control who copied their work.
Ah, the authors finally get a say.
Yes. And it protected works for a limited time, which was also revolutionary, 14 years, and you could renew it once if the author was still alive.
14 years sounds so short now.
It does. But back then,
Yeah.
and its full title tells you a lot, an act for the encouragement of learning. The whole point was balancing access to knowledge with giving creators an incentive.
Encouragement of learning. Okay.
And this lined up perfectly with the dawn of the Enlightenment, early 1700s. Reason, individual rights, education were the big themes. Thinkers like John Locke were arguing people had a natural right to the fruits of their labor.
Like, if you wrote it, you should benefit from it.
Exactly. That idea got applied directly to writing, so copyright fit right in with those Enlightenment ideals. Plus, literacy was rising. A new middle-class reading public was emerging, creating this huge market for different kinds of books. And authors naturally wanted to profit from their work's popularity, not just let the printers take everything. It really kickstarted a creative economy beyond just printing.
That connection to the Enlightenment is fascinating. Owning your ideas as a kind of natural right. But, okay, once you have this concept of intellectual property, what happens when someone doesn't play by the rules? What does infringement actually mean today, and why is it seen as such a problem?
Right. Well, infringement is basically using, copying, or distributing work that's copyrighted without getting permission from the owner. And crucially, it has to be outside of specific exceptions, like fair use, which we can get into.
Okay.
It's usually a civil offense, sometimes even criminal, depending on the scale.
And why is it considered harmful? What are the arguments?
There are a few layers. First, the most obvious one is economic harm. Think piracy movies, music. It directly takes money away from creators.
Right, lost sales.
And in creative fields, often the profits from one project fund the next one. So unauthorized copying can actually discourage people from creating more. Second, there are what's called moral rights or authorial rights. Creators often feel this deep connection to their work.
Like it's a part of them.
Exactly. And infringement can distort it, misuse it, maybe misattribute it, that violates those moral rights. And finally, maybe most fundamentally, it's about legal order. Imagine a world with no rules about this stuff, with instant replication. It'd be chaos.
Total Wild West.
Yeah. Who owns what?
Yeah.
Who gets paid? Copyright provides a framework, a way to manage disputes in this world where copying is so easy.
Okay, so that brings us to maybe the trickiest part, where the conceptual framework really gets tested. This crucial difference in copyright law, ideas versus expression. Can you actually own an idea?
Short answer, absolutely not. Copyright law is crystal clear on this. It does not protect ideas. It protects the expression of ideas.
Okay, expression, not the idea itself. Why that distinction?
Well, think about it. It's incredibly practical. If you could copyright a broad idea, like, say, a young hero goes on a journey.
Huh. Yeah, half of literature and movies would disappear overnight.
Exactly. Storytelling would just grind to a halt. Ideas need to be out there in the public domain for culture to evolve, for people to build on them, remix them.
So what is protected then? What counts as expression?
It's the original way you express those ideas, the specific words you choose in a book, the unique framing of a photograph, a particular visual design, the actual dialogue in a script, a distinctive melody in a song.
Got it. Concrete examples help.
Right. So you can't copyright the general idea of star-crossed lovers. Too broad.
Okay.
But you can copyright the actual script of Romeo and Juliet, that specific expression.
Makes sense.
Or the idea of a boy wizard going to school, that's just an idea, not copyrightable.
Harry Potter.
Harry Potter, the specific world, Hogwarts, Quidditch, the wands, those characters like Harry, Ron, Hermione, absolutely copyrightable. They are detailed, distinct expressions. Generally, if characters are well-developed and distinct, specific scenes, dialogue, prose, artwork, those are protected.
But not things like general themes or tropes or just the basic plot structure.
Correct. Tropes, archetypes, plot skeletons, those are considered part of the idea side of the line.
Okay, that distinction idea versus expression seems pretty clear when you lay it out like that, like with Harry Potter. But I bet the real world throws some curveballs. Where does this start to get, complicated or fuzzy in practice?
Oh, it definitely does. That's where we hit what you might call the fuzzy, messy middle. For instance, there's a concept called scenes of fare. These are scenes that are almost like required by a genre.
Scenes that must be done,
Like a detective interrogating a suspect in a police station in a crime thriller, or a chase scene in an action movie.
Ah, okay.
You can't really copyright that because it's such a standard, generic element. If you could, we'd run out of crime thrillers fast.
Right. It's part of the genre's toolkit.
Exactly. Then there's something called thin copyright. Some characters or concepts might only get limited protection because they're not super unique, like a generic masked killer in a slasher film. Maybe not much protection. But Jason Voorhees, with his specific hockey mask and machete, that's a distinct expression, definitely protected.
Okay. The more generic, the less protection.
Generally, yes. And derivative works are another area. If you take a character or world and remix it, it might still fall under the original copyright unless your version is substantially transformed.
And that's where fair use might come in.
Precisely. Fair use analysis looks at how transformative the new work is. It's a key part of navigating that messy middle.
It sounds like we're constantly walking this tightrope, navigating these really complex ethical waters, especially when the lines get so blurry. How do these practical issues, these fuzzy areas, then blow up into bigger legal and maybe even philosophical challenges?
Well, it creates a lot of room for potential overreach, for one thing. Some large corporations, the Disneys or Warner Brothers of the world, have reputations for using copyright pretty aggressively, sometimes to suppress competition, sometimes even parody.
Right, wielding it like a weapon sometimes.
Some argue that, yes. And it's worth remembering, too, trademarks like logos and brand names can last forever if you keep renewing them. But copyright duration itself, currently life of the author plus 70 years in many places. A lot of people argue that's just far too long.
Life plus 70, wow.
Yeah. And this all feeds into a fundamental tension. Creativity versus control. Think about it. Artists always build on the work of other artists. That's just how art happens.
It's always derivative in some sense.
Exactly. So, is it really fair to restrict that process too much? Can we even say an idea is truly original, or is it always a recombination of things that came before? And in practice, when these cases go to court, judges often have to decide based on something called substantial similarity.
Which sounds vague.
It is incredibly vague. It's subjective. One judge might look at two works and say they're similar enough to be infringement. Another might disagree. It depends heavily on interpretation.
So, if the courts are dealing with substantial similarity and things are messy, let's apply this to some really hot button areas right now. Fan fiction, AI generated content, music sampling. How does this idea versus expression thing play out there? What's protected, what isn't, and where's the gray zone?
Okay, great examples. Let's break them down. First, fan fiction. What's protected? Almost always the core elements from the original work. The copyrighted characters like Harry Potter, Hermione, the worlds like the Star Wars universe,
Hmm.
maybe even specific catchphrases or plot points. These are distinctive creative expressions.
Right, the stuff the original author created.
Exactly. What's not protected? The general ideas, like the idea of a magic school or a galactic empire, or common storytelling tropes like, say, a love triangle.
Okay, so where's the gray area?
The big gray area is fair use, particularly in the U.S. Fan fiction is often seen as transformative. It reinterprets the original characters, puts them in new situations. If it's non-commercial, meaning the fanfic author isn't selling it, and doesn't harm the market for the original books or movies, it might qualify as fair use.
But it's not guaranteed.
No, it's decided case by case, and authors have different views. Some, like Anne Rice, famously banned it. Others, like Neil Gaiman, actively encourage it.
So it's kind of technically infringement, maybe, but often overlooked.
That's a good way to put it. Technically infringement, but socially tolerated captures it well. It exists in this sort of legal limbo driven by fandom culture.
Okay, next up, AI-generated content. This feels like the Wild West right now.
It absolutely is. It's evolving incredibly fast, and the legal battles are just starting. So what's protected? Well, the training data definitely is. The billions of copyrighted books, songs, images that the AI models learn from those are protected works.
Right, the stuff it eats.
Exactly. And if you specifically use an AI to replicate an existing artist's style very closely, like asking it to write a song in the style of George R. R. Martin and sounds just like him, that resulting output could be considered an infringing derivative work.
Even if the AI wrote it.
Potentially. Yes, because it's deriving directly from his protected expression. Now, the output of the AI itself, that's tricky. In the U.S., current guidance says copyright requires human authorship. So an image generated purely by AI from a simple text prompt generally isn't copyrightable by the AI or the user of the prompt alone.
So the AI can't own the copyright.
Correct. However, if a human provides substantial creative input and direction to the AI throughout the process, the resulting work might be eligible for copyright protection for the human author.
So human involvement is key. What's not protected then?
Outputs generated with minimal human creative input, or very generic outputs, like you ask for a picture of a fantasy village at sunset and get something standard.
And the gray area must be huge here.
Massive. Did the AI steal styles from its training data? That's a huge ethical and legal question. What counts as transformative use? Is an AI-generated Beatles song, but in a death metal style, transformative enough?
I'd love to hear that.
Right. And fundamental questions remain. Who owns the rights to the training data? Who owns the combination of the prompt and the output? The law is racing to catch up. Courts are grappling with this right now.
Okay, finally, music sampling. This one's been around longer, but still seems contentious.
It has, and it's perhaps the most litigated of the three in terms of established case law, at least historically. What's protected? Two distinct things, usually. The master recording, the actual sound recording you hear, and the musical composition, the underlying melody, harmony, lyrics.
So the sound in the song itself.
Precisely. And the threshold for infringement can be surprisingly low. Using even a few seconds of a distinctive recorded guitar riff, drum loop, or vocal hook without permission is generally infringement.
Even just a tiny bit.
If it's recognizable and distinctive, yes. You typically need to get a license permission, often involving payment for both the recording and the composition, unless it qualifies as fair use, which is historically very difficult to argue for music sampling.
What isn't protected then? Can you sample anything?
Very short, completely generic snippets like a single unadorned drum hit or a basic common chord progression like IVV or simple rhythmic patterns. Those are generally considered building blocks, not protectable expression. Hell, even a short sample, if it's highly distinctive and recognizable, think of the famous Amen break drum solo.
Oh yeah, that's everywhere.
Exactly. That is protected, despite being short.
And the gray area here?
It used to involve a concept called de minimis, basically arguing the sample was too small or insignificant to matter legally. But a major U.S. court case, Bridgeport Music, famously ruled back in 2005 that for sound recordings, any unauthorized sample, no matter how short, requires a license. Get a license or do not sample, the court said.
Wow. Zero tolerance.
Pretty much, for the sound recording part. Now, some courts have pushed back on that a bit, especially for samples that are truly transformative or completely unrecognizable in the new context. And there's a difference with interpolations. That's where you re-record the part yourself instead of using the original audio.
Ah, you play it again instead of lifting the sound.
Right. In that case, you only need clearance for the musical composition, not the master recording,
Yeah.
because you haven't used the original audio. But still, sampling without getting clearance is almost always a risky move legally.
That's a fantastic breakdown. It really shows how these principles play out or sometimes get tangled up in modern creative practices. It seems like we keep bumping up against this idea. Isn't the very soul of creativity about building on what came before? I mean, is anything ever truly completely original? Aren't we all just, standing on the shoulders of giants?
You've absolutely hit on a core truth there. Art has always drawn inspiration from other art. Always. You mentioned Bach inspiring Beethoven. Shakespeare famously borrowed plots heavily. Hip-hop was literally born from sampling funk, jazz, soul records.
The good artists copy, great artists steal idea.
Exactly. That quote often misattributed to Picasso, but the sentiment holds. There really isn't any pure isolated creation. Every artist, consciously or not, works within a lineage, using tools and ideas inherited from others. AI, in a way, just makes that lineage explicit and automates the process of drawing from it, often at incredible scale and speed.
But does that automation change the ethics?
That's the crux of the debate. It leads to this critical ethical dilemma around scale, access, and, crucially, power. When an individual artist uses AI for inspiration, maybe to explore styles they couldn't otherwise access, they're often following that same historical path of artistic development, creating something new, usually not trying to build a monopoly.
Okay, like a tool for personal creativity.
Right. But when a massive corporation with, huge legal teams steps in to aggressively protect its assets, its character likenesses, its music catalog, its brand, that's when you really see the stark tension of gatekeeping.
Gatekeeping, how so?
There's just a massive power imbalance. One side can afford years of litigation. The other side often can't even afford a lawyer to respond to a cease and desist letter.
Right, David versus Goliath, but Goliath has infinite lawyers.
Pretty much. And this creates a chilling effect. Even ethical creators, people trying to do transformative work, might become afraid to publish anything that even remotely resembles existing IP just to avoid the risk of a lawsuit.
Which could stifle innovation.
Absolutely. It becomes this fundamental clash between corporate control, protecting existing revenue streams, and the natural evolution of culture, which relies on borrowing and transforming.
So it sounds like copyright, which started as this tool to encourage learning and creativity, can sometimes morph into a way for established players to kind of pull up the ladder behind them.
That's certainly one perspective, yeah.
But isn't there also a counter argument? These large companies, they invest millions, sometimes billions, into creating IP like Marvel or Star Wars. Don't they have a legitimate need, even a right, to protect those massive investments to fund future creativity?
That is precisely the tension, and it's a valid point. If we assume, for the sake of argument, that an AI was trained on copyrighted works without getting permission.
Which is a big if being debated right now.
A huge if, yes. But if so, a corporation might reasonably argue, hey, that's unauthorized use of our intellectual property. It's like the AI copied our character designs, our story elements, our musical style.
Copying our brushstrokes, as you put it.
Right. But the creator, using the AI, might counter, hold on, I didn't ask it to replicate your work. I used an algorithm trained on a vast range of styles, including, but not limited to yours, to create something original that expresses my own vision. So the key legal and, maybe more importantly, moral question becomes, is learning from vast amounts of art the same thing as stealing it? Humans do this constantly, right? We learn by studying masters, by absorbing influences. We don't get sued for having a style reminiscent of Picasso unless we're actually forging his signature. Why should algorithmic learning necessarily be treated differently?
That's a really sharp question. And you mentioned gatekeeping before as a systemic problem. Can you elaborate a bit on why that dynamic can be so, toxic?
It becomes toxic when the goal shifts from genuinely protecting creators or preventing confusion to simply controlling the field and maximizing profit by excluding others. This happens when, say, only certain people get access to the tools, the platforms the audiences needed to create and share work. Or when powerful institutions get to define what counts as legitimate art, often marginalizing newer or different forms.
Controlling the narrative.
Exactly. And when legal resources are used not to clarify the rules for everyone, but to police the gray areas in a way that benefits the powerful and chills innovation from smaller players. In this kind of environment, large rights holders can start to look less like stewards of culture and more like, well, guardians of profit streams, using the language of ethics and rights to justify what's essentially monopolistic behavior.
Guardians of profit streams. That's a strong phrase. So, given these systemic issues and the power dynamics, are there any potential paths forward, any ethical middle grounds we could explore to navigate this better?
People are definitely thinking about this. The current system feels strained. Some potential ideas are being floated. One is the idea of collective licensing pools. Imagine AI companies pay into a central fund based on their use of training data. Then artists whose works were influential in that data could be compensated, maybe based on metrics, similar to how music royalties work for radio play or streaming.
Like ACE-CAP or BMI, but for AI training data.
Sort of, yeah. A mechanism for compensation at scale. Another idea is transparent AI training disclosure. This would involve AI companies being open about what data their models were trained on, maybe allowing artists to opt in or opt out, and informing users about the styles the AI is drawing from.
More transparency, more choice for artists.
Right. And finally, developing new norms for attribution. Even if the law doesn't strictly require it, creating a culture where AI users give credit to the artists or styles that significantly influence the output could build a lot of goodwill and trust within the creative community.
Interesting. So shifting norms, not just laws. It's clear this isn't just a dry legal debate. It's hitting deep issues about how we value art, artists, and influence itself. Let's really dig into some of those deeper insights and counter-arguments, looking at the core tensions we've kind of circled around.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
Let's start with tension #1, monopoly versus culture. We asked, when is it justified for a powerful entity, a company, or maybe a huge artist to protect their monopoly using copyright? Well, it seems warranted in clear cases of direct competition, or, importantly, confusion. Like if someone releases an AI song and falsely labels it as a new Drake track to trick listeners. Protecting the brand and preventing fraud seems fair.
Okay, preventing deception.
Right, also preventing clear exploitation of labor. Imagine someone scraping fan art sites, feeding it all into an AI, and then selling prints of the output without any credit or compensation to the original fan artists. That feels exploitative.
Yeah, that crosses a line.
Moral rights and legacy matter too. An artist might have legitimate reasons to protect their work from being used in ways that distort its meaning, or associate it with hateful ideologies. Think about sensitive works related to the Holocaust, or sacred motifs being used disrespectfully.
Protecting the work's integrity.
Exactly. And finally, the argument about high investment risk. Studios pour millions, even billions, into building franchises like Marvel or Star Wars. Protecting that IP allows them to continue funding those large-scale productions. So protecting the investment can enable future creation, at least of that type. The key insight here maybe is that these justifications are mostly about protection preventing direct harm, confusion, or exploitation, not necessarily about preventing any new voices or transformative uses from emerging.
Okay, so protection, not prevention. When is monopoly protection not warranted then, or becomes problematic?
It becomes problematic when it starts chilling cultural dialogue. Using copyright lawsuits to silence legitimate criticism, commentary, or parody stifles important conversations that culture needs to have.
Like using copyright to shut down negative reviews.
Or critiques expressed through art itself. Also, when there's an overreach of duration, we talked about life plus 70 years. When corporations lobby to extend copyright terms, mainly to keep valuable properties like Mickey Mouse out of the public domain indefinitely, many argue that stops serving the public good.
Right, the encouragement of learning part gets lost.
Exactly. It's also problematic when influence is weaponized suing a small indie creator because their AI-generated image has a vague resemblance to a famous artist's style, especially when there's clearly no market harm or confusion. That feels like bullying.
Using legal might to squash potential competition, even if it's tiny.
Perhaps. And fundamentally, when there's no real market harm, if someone creates transformative fan art purely for non-commercial purposes, sharing it within a fan community that the original creator doesn't even target, does a lawsuit really serve the purpose of copyright? Many would say no.
Okay, that's monopoly versus culture. What about the second big tension, inspiration versus infringement?
Right. When is an artist, using AI or not, ethically and legally in the clear when drawing inspiration? They're generally protected when the use is clearly transformative. Does the new work add something new? Does it comment on the original? Does it change the meaning or context? Think of Weird Al's parodies. They use the music but create entirely new comedic lyrics. That's transformative. An AI remix changing genre or tone might also qualify.
Adding new meaning or message.
Yes. Independent expression is also key. You're absolutely allowed to be inspired by Kendrick Lamar's flow or production style. But if you make a track that sounds exactly like his beats and rapping patterns, you're crossing the line from inspiration to imitation or infringement.
So influence is fine, copying isn't.
Generally, it's also usually protected when it's part of a cultural dialogue art responding to other art. And non-commercial creation, like fan art shared online or using AI tools privately just to experiment, is typically seen as part of the creative sandbox, less likely to cause legal trouble, though not immune.
Okay, so when are artists not protected? When does inspiration become infringement?
The clearest case is plagiarism or direct copying. If the output, whether human-made or AI-generated, is a near replica of an existing copyrighted work, that's almost always infringement. Intent doesn't always matter if the similarity is striking.
Even if you didn't mean to copy.
Potentially, yes, if it's substantially similar. Impersonation is another big one, trying to pass off your work as being by or endorsed by the original famous artist, especially for profit. That combines copyright issues with things like right of publicity and trademark.
Like fake celebrity endorsements using AI voices.
Exactly. And finally, a lack of transformation. If the borrowing is superficial, if you just ask an AI, draw this scene in the style of Van Gogh, and the result is basically indistinguishable from a Van Gogh painting without adding any new commentary or context, it's much harder to argue it's fair use or mere inspiration. It looks more like a copy.
That's a really useful framework for thinking through those nuances. It definitely shows that just saying copying isn't enough. We need to ask how and why it's being used. But thinking about these tensions, monopoly versus culture, inspiration versus infringement, does digging into them reveal even deeper layers? Maybe insights about how creativity actually works versus how the law tries to box it in?
Yes, I think it absolutely does. Let's peel back another layer. First, consider this. Is inspiration truly ever original? We've touched on this. All artists remix existing elements, language, tropes, styles, sounds. The difference with AI isn't necessarily what it's doing, learning from examples, but how it does it, and the traceability. Humans are rarely sued just for being too inspired by someone because it's hard to prove and often subconscious.
Right. You can't easily scan a human brain for influences.
Exactly. But AI processes leave digital footprints. Its influences, drawn from training data, are potentially measurable, trackable. The sheer visibility of the influence might make AI-driven inspiration seem more like theft or copying than the same process happening inside a human mind, even if the creative act is similar.
So the transparency makes it seem more suspect, ironically.
It could. The appearance of mechanical reproduction versus organic inspiration. Second, let's revisit the moral case for monopoly. Is there one? Yes, absolutely, but perhaps with caveats. The moral rights we discussed, attribution, getting credit, integrity, protection from distortion, and fair economic compensation, are vital for respecting artists.
They deserve recognition and reward.
For sure. But when copyright protection becomes nearly perpetual or is used to stifle transformative works rather than protect against direct exploitation, does it still serve that moral purpose? Or does it become a cultural bottleneck? Maybe the insight here is that a moral claim to monopoly is earned through responsible stewardship of the work within the culture, not just through legal ownership papers.
Stewardship, not just ownership. That's a recurring theme.
It seems important. Third, could over-enforcement actually backfire? History suggests it often does. Think about early jazz critics called it derivative, even noise. Early hip-hop faced intense legal battles over sampling that nearly killed the genre before licensing systems adapted.
Right. The culture eventually finds a way, but maybe after a lot of friction.
Exactly. Today, AI creators are facing similar scrutiny and legal threats. It's possible that overly aggressive enforcement now might just lead to a backlash later or drive innovation underground, ultimately delaying cultural evolution rather than guiding it productively.
So trying to lock everything down might just break the lock.
Or force people to build entirely new doors outside the established system.
These insights really challenge our basic assumptions about creating things. It's not just legal rules, it's about the nature of creativity itself. So to wrap up this deep dive, let's maybe explore some of those less discussed but maybe crucial dimensions that cut across psychology, economics, ethics, even cultural theory. What else should we be considering?
Okay, yeah, let's broaden the lens a bit. Here are a few dimensions that often get overlooked. One is this idea of the illusion of absolute ownership versus stewardship. We tend to treat copyright like owning a piece of land, absolute control. But as we've said, No creative work arises from nothing. Every creator uses shared language, cultural symbols, genre conventions, tools they didn't invent. They draw from the commons.
Right, building on shared foundations.
So the more culturally significant a work becomes, the more it becomes part of that shared culture, maybe the less justifiable it is for one entity to claim total perpetual control over its use and meaning. This suggests that maybe a stewardship model makes more sense ethically. Creators and their estates or companies are temporary custodians, responsible for honoring the work's legacy and ensuring fair compensation, but not for hoarding its cultural utility forever.
Custodians of cultural artifacts. I like that. It changes the frame from owner to caretaker. What else?
Another point, monopolies aren't just economic. They're also epistemic,
Oh.
meaning they control knowledge and perception. They don't just control the money flow. They influence what gets seen, what gets defined as important or good art, and ultimately, who gets to speak and be heard.
How does that work in practice?
Think about algorithmic curation on streaming platforms, often favoring established players. Or legal precedents set by well-funded litigants, making it harder for smaller creators to challenge norms. Or even just a few dominant companies shaping the cultural narrative around what kind of stories or music are valuable.
So it shapes what we even think of as culture.
Exactly. The harm isn't just lost potential profits for others. Entire aesthetics, perspectives, maybe even entire communities' voices can be effectively silenced or marginalized.
It's not just about lost revenue, it's about lost voices, lost ways of seeing.
Precisely. And that connects to another point. Overemphasis on ownership can undermine collaboration. Traditional copyright, being highly focused on individual rights and contracts, can sometimes foster a culture of fear and suspicion around borrowing or building on others' work. Did I clear this? Could I get sued?
Makes people hesitant to connect ideas.
Right. In contrast, think about things like open source software, remix culture online, even the way AI models learn collaboratively from vast data sets. These models kind of invite co-authorship, working with systems with communities, sometimes with strangers. Perhaps these new forms of creativity are demanding new models of collective ownership or recognition, where things like clear attribution and shared benefit matter more than strict exclusion and control.
Moving beyond the lone genius model.
Maybe. And here's a really provocative thought we touched on. AI isn't necessarily a thief. It might be a mirror with a telescope. It doesn't just steal styles. It reflects our existing culture back at us, often amplifying patterns, combining things in unexpected ways, sometimes exaggerating traits to the point of abstraction.
What do you mean by mirror?
Well, if AI-generated art often feels soulless or generic, maybe that says something about the source material, the vast amounts of mainstream art it was trained on. If an AI easily makes a beat that sounds like every other top 40 hit, maybe it's because the top 40 has become quite formulaic and predictable.
Huh. So AI exposes our own lack of originality sometimes.
It can. It can reveal the limits of our current creative patterns by showing just how easily they can be replicated or predicted by an algorithm. It forces us to ask what truly makes human creativity unique.
That's a challenging perspective. AI is a reflection of us.
It is. And we also need to acknowledge that inspiration isn't always conscious or traceable. Legal frameworks tend to assume that influence is intentional, something you can point to. But artists absorb influences subconsciously, through years of exposure, through feeling, through culture. It's embodied, emotional, often untraceable. An artist, being original, is still remixing countless internalized influences without even realizing it.
Things they soaked up without knowing.
Exactly. So if all creativity is fundamentally recombinant in this way, drawing sharp legal lines around who influenced whom is always going to be somewhat arbitrary and maybe miss the point of how creativity actually flows.
It's messier than the law likes to admit.
Much messier.
Yeah.
And finally, a crucial point about equity. Copyright can reinforce inequity, not just protect art. We see well-resourced companies buying up the rights to long-dead artists' catalogs and then using that ownership to sue small indie creators or gatekeep access. Meanwhile, artists from emerging scenes or marginalized communities might see their unique aesthetics mined by AI tools trained on publicly available data, like images scraped from the web, often with no credit or compensation flowing back to those originators.
So the powerful extract value while the originators get nothing.
That's the risk. If copyright enforcement isn't paired with mechanisms for equity and recognition, it can inadvertently end up colonizing creativity, extracting value from the cultural periphery while silencing or marginalizing the source. And one last nuance. There's a big difference between making a copy and making a response.
Explain.
Reproducing someone's song almost exactly to try and trick people into thinking it's the original that's clearly problematic. But writing a new song that's clearly inspired by the first one, maybe references it, maybe even critiques or challenges it, that's how cultural conversations happen.
Like a dialogue between works.
Exactly. But current systems, especially automated ones like Content ID on YouTube, might flag both as potential infringement. If we suppress the responses, the replies, we're not protecting culture. We're breaking the conversation. Culture is that ongoing dialogue, not just a static product line.
Wow. Okay, that's a lot of deep intersecting dimensions there. So pulling it all together, what does this really mean for us, for the future of creativity in this landscape?
I think the central shift that seems necessary based on all these tensions and insights is moving away from viewing creative work solely as parcels of intellectual real estate to be owned and defended, and towards seeing it as part of a dynamic, networked ecosystem.
An ecosystem.
Yeah.
Like nature.
Yeah, in a way. Some creators are like pollinators, spreading styles and ideas. Others are like composters, breaking down old forms to create fertile ground for new growth. Some are architects, building new structures using the shared soil of culture. In that kind of ecosystem view, protection against genuine harm, like plagiarism or exploitation, is still necessary. But strategies based on total domination, fear, and excessive control, those look less like protecting the garden and more like paving it over.
So let me try and recap some of the core insights from this deep dive. First, copyright is a tool, right? Not some eternal truth. It was invented for a purpose to encourage learning, serve culture, incentivize creation.
Right.
And when it stops doing that effectively or starts actively hindering it through overreach or gatekeeping, it's not just failing, it can actually be harmful.
Well put.
Second, we really hit on this idea that all art is echo, remix, and reply. There's no pristine, untouched creative mind operating in a vacuum. AI just makes this remixing process more visible, maybe more efficient, more mechanical. But the spark, the intent, the originality still seems to reside with the human using the tool, not the tool itself.
That seems to be where the consensus is heading, legally and ethically.
Okay, so if the old tools and categories, copy, theft, ownership, are feeling strained, maybe even breaking under the pressure of AI, networked creativity, global culture, it means we need a new toolbox.
That sounds right.
Things like new ethical frameworks, maybe emphasizing that idea of stewardship over absolute control. New legal models like those collective licensing pools or clearer rules for transformative use. And just new cultural norms around attribution, remixing, respectful response.
Building a healthier ecosystem.
Exactly. It sounds like the future of creativity isn't about building higher walls and locking the gates, but about learning how to better tend the creative commons we all draw from.
A more collaborative, less adversarial approach.
And one final crucial point you raised that feels essential to keep in mind: power matters. The same act, referencing another artist, borrowing a style, using AI, can have a radically different ethical weight depending on who is doing it and why.
Context is everything.
Right. A billionaire tech firm scraping unpaid artists' work off the internet to train a commercial AI model feels fundamentally different extractive, maybe than a marginalized creator using AI to access tools or aesthetics they were previously locked out of, which could be seen as reparative or empowering.
The power dynamics change the moral calculus completely.
So maybe the core question isn't always just was it copied? Maybe it's also who benefits, who is potentially harmed, and is the overall culture richer or poorer because this happened?
Asking those harder, more nuanced questions.
Yeah. So let's leave our listeners with this thought. In this constantly evolving landscape of creation and control, if we believe that creation is a right, not just a privilege, then how do we contribute to building a system that truly values human ingenuity and expression, while also acknowledging that no single person, no single company, no matter how iconic, should get to own the entire cultural conversation?
A question worth wrestling with.
Definitely something to think about. Thank you for that incredible deep dive.
My pleasure. It's a fascinating area.